The Hermes scar sailed through the air in slow motion, a crimson streak against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the 45th floor. It landed on the polished mahogany conference table with barely a whisper, but the sound that followed shattered the carefully maintained silence that governed Kensington Holdings. Emily Kensington, 7 years old and barely tall enough to see over the table's edge, when standing, swept her arm across the surface with the kind of rage that comes from a place deeper than childhood tantrums. Folders erupted into the air, their contents creating a brief paper snowstorm. Financial reports from the Singapore office, projections for the London expansion, confidential memos about the Burley's acquisition. All of it became confetti in the hands of a child who'd stopped believing in order the day her father's plane fell from the sky. Dr. Patricia Holbrook stumbled backward, her briefcase clutched against her chest like riot gear. She'd trained at Yale, completed her fellowship at the Child Mind Institute, published 2 books on pediatric trauma, and in this moment, all that expertise meant nothing. The little girl advancing toward her wasn't seeing a trained professional with credentials that read like a doctoral thesis. She was seeing another adult who wanted to talk about feelings, another stranger asking her to trust another person who would eventually leave. Emily's voice cracked as she screamed, the sound raw and primal. The words themselves were lost in the violence of her delivery, but the message landed clear enough. Dr. Holbrook's hand found the door handle. Her departure was swift professional training abandoned in favor of basic survival instinct. The door clicked shut with a sound like a judge's gavel. Clara Kensington remained by the window, her Armani suit cut with such precision it could have been armor. Her reflection in the glass showed a woman of 32 whose face had been sculpted by loss into something harder than the material success surrounding her. She didn't turn to watch the therapist flee. That would have required acknowledging defeat, and Clara had built her empire on refusing to recognize the existence of losing. Her eyes stayed fixed on the Manhattan skyline, tracking the movement of clouds across the sun. The light shifted from gold to gray and back again, indifferent to the human drama playing out in the room behind her. The silence after the therapist's departure carried weight. Emily stood in the center of the destruction she'd created, her chest heaving, her small hands still clenched into fists. Papers continued to drift downwards, settling around her like fallout. Clara watched their reflection in the window, mother and daughter, existing in the same space, but separated by a chasm that grew wider with each passing day. 5 therapists in 3 months. The number sat in Clara's mind with the precision of a quarterly earnings report, another metric of failure she couldn't strategy her way around. The words slipped from Clara's mouth, barely audible, more prayer than question. Can no one reach this child? The skyline offered no answers. 43 floors below, in the basement-level break room that smelled of industrial cleaner and burnt coffee. Another story was unfolding in a different key. Ethan Cole held his daughter against his chest, her weight familiar as his own heartbeat. Lila had fallen asleep on the subway, exhausted from a morning spent chasing pigeons in the park before school. At 6 years old, she still believed the world was fundamentally kind, still thought every stranger was a potential friend, still hummed made-up songs about clouds shaped like animals. Her hair smelled like the strawberry shampoo they bought in bulk from the corner store, the cheap kind that came in bottles the size of her torso. He'd learned to braid it in the dark during those first impossible months after Sarah died, his hands moving through the motions while his mind screamed with grief. The lullaby emerged without conscious thought, muscle memory, overriding the exhaustion that had settled into his bones after a decade of early shifts and late nights. Sarah had sung this melody to her own swollen belly during the final weeks of pregnancy, when even breathing required concentration, and every movement was calculated risk. She'd made up nonsense words about stars and ocean waves and promises that everything would be gentle for this new life they'd created. Ethan hummed the tune now, wordless, letting the notes carry the love he couldn't speak. His voice drifted through the ventilation system that connected every floor of Kensington Holdings, climbing through ducts and grates, reaching spaces the engineers who designed the building never imagined mattered. 43 floors up in the wreckage of her tantrum, Emily's head lifted. The change was subtle, a shift in the angle of her spine, a release of tension in her shoulders. Her tears stopped midstream, salt tracks still wet on her cheeks, but no new drops falling. The sound reaching her through the air vent was distant, distorted by the journey through metal and insulation, but it carried something the expensive therapists, with their carefully modulated voices never had. It carried the kind of gentleness that comes from someone who understands that pain doesn't respond to technique or credentials, only to the willingness to sit with another person in the dark and keep breathing. For the first time in months, something penetrated the wall Emily had built around herself, brick by brick, grief by grief. She moved toward the vent, small hands pressed against the metal grate, trying to get closer to the source of the sound. The melody wound through her rib cage, found the place where her own sorrow lived, and didn't try to fix it or explain it away. It just existed alongside her company in the loneliness. Clara saw none of this. She was already moving toward her office, heels clicking against marble, in a rhythm that spoke of control, regained, crisis managed, next item on the agenda. Behind her, Emily remained crouched by the vent, listening to a stranger's lullaby, experiencing something that would change the trajectory of her life, and her mother's, though neither of them knew it yet. The sun broke through the clouds outside, flooding the conference room with light that made the scattered papers glow like promise. Ethan's mornings began at 4:30 when most of the city still slept, and the darkness felt like privacy. The alarm on his phone played a soft chime he'd recorded himself years ago, back when he understood the science of sound waves and frequency response, when he could look at a waveform on a screen and hear the music before the speakers played it. Now he used that knowledge to wake himself gently, a rising tone that pulled him from sleep without the violence of a traditional alarm. Lila needed quiet mornings. Chaos sent her into sensory overload, made her small body vibrate with anxiety that would take hours to settle. The apartment in Queens had been advertised as cozy, which was realtor speak for barely large enough for two people who loved each other. One bedroom that Lila claimed with her drawings taped to every wall, butterflies and rainbows, and stick figures holding hands under crayon suns. Ethan slept on a pull-out couch that had come from a sidewalk in Brooklyn, its springs singing protest every time he shifted position. The radiator clanged like it was trying to communicate in Morse code, and the neighbors, a couple who worked night shifts at different hospitals, argued through walls so thin Ethan knew their grievances better than his own sometimes. He stood at the kitchen window while the coffee brewed, watching the sky shift from black to charcoal to the particular gray that passed for dawn in the city. The coffee maker was older than Lila, a machine he'd bought at a yard sale when Sarah was pregnant, and they were trying to save every dollar for the medical bills they knew were coming. It made coffee that tasted like metal and burned toast, but it worked, and that mattered more than flavor. Ethan had learned to find grace in functionality, beauty in things that served their purpose without complaint. The morning routine was choreographed with precision. Lila woke at 5:45, stumbling into the kitchen in her unicorn pajamas, one sock on and one sock lost somewhere in the tangled sheets. She climbed into his lap while he drank his second cup of coffee. Her body still soft with sleep, and together they watched the day arrive. She chattered in that stream of consciousness way children have, jumping from topic to topic without transition, connecting butterflies to breakfast to a dream she'd had about flying. Ethan listened with the kind of attention most people reserved for important meetings, because he'd learned that children spelled love, T-I-M-E, and this was the currency he had to offer. Braiding her hair required concentration. His fingers, scarred from years of handling equipment and calloused from mop handles that never quite fit his grip correctly, moved with surprising gentleness through the honey-brown strands. Sarah had taught him this in the hospital during those final days when they both knew she wouldn't see their daughter's first birthday. She'd guided his hands through the motions, patient, despite the pain that had her breathing in careful, measured sips. 3 sections, over and under, keep the tension even. He'd practiced on yarn while Sarah slept, determined to master this one skill that would let his daughter move through the world looking cared for. The subway at 6:30 was already crowded with people whose shifts started too early, whose jobs required them to be invisible in buildings owned by people who slept until the sun was already high. Ethan and Lila found their spot near the doors, his hand wrapped around the pole, her hand wrapped around his wrist. She pressed against his leg, watching the other passengers with open curiosity that hadn't yet been trained into the blank-faced indifference adults wore like uniforms. He hummed quietly fragments of melodies that had been hits a decade ago when he'd worked in studios with soundboards that cost more than most cars, when artists whose names still topped charts had asked his opinion on reverb and compression. Sound engineering had been his calling, not just his career. He understood music the way some people understood mathematics, could hear the architecture of a song, knew instinctively where a frequency was muddying the mix or where a vocal needed space to breathe. He'd worked sessions that ran 48 hours straight, surviving on coffee and the high of creating something that would outlive everyone in the room. The artists trusted him because he never tried to make their music fit a template. He listened to what they were trying to express and found ways to make those emotions audible, tangible, real. Then Sarah got pregnant and the complications began. The bleeding that started in the second trimester, the blood pressure that climbed despite medication, the look on the doctor's face when she said bed rest wasn't optional anymore, it was survival protocol. Ethan had started taking shorter sessions, turning down tours, choosing projects that kept him in the city. The money got tighter, but Lila was coming, and nothing mattered more than being there, being present, being ready. The emergency happened on a Tuesday afternoon when he was mixing a track for an indie artist who was about to sign with a major label. Sarah called from the hospital, her voice tight with controlled terror. He ran out mid-session, left the artist and the engineer and the producer staring at each other in confusion, made it to the hospital in time to hear the doctor present the choice that wasn't really a choice at all. The baby's heart rate was dropping. Sarah was hemorrhaging internally. They could try to save both, but would likely lose both, or they could make a decision now. Sarah had already made it. The note she pressed into the nurse's hand was written in handwriting that trembled with pain and certainty. Save our daughter. Her name is Lila. Tell her I'm in every song she'll ever hear. The sound of the machines flatlining was the last piece of music Ethan mixed with full attention. He'd memorized every frequency, every harmonic, the way the room's acoustics shaped that awful sustained tone. It lived in his head, still surfacing at unexpected moments, a constant reminder of the price his daughter's life had cost. He woke up to Lila's cries for a year straight, bottles and diapers, and a grief so complete it felt like drowning in slow motion. The studio called with offers. He turned them down. His reputation would survive. A hiatus, they said. Take time, they said. Come back when he was ready. He never went back. By the time Lila was sleeping through the night and smiling at his terrible jokes, by the time he'd learned to cook something beyond microwave disasters, by the time he emerged from the fog of new fatherhood, enough to think about work, his contacts had moved on. The industry had evolved. New engineers with new techniques had taken the sessions he used to book months in advance. His name, which had once opened doors, was now just another entry in credits of songs that played on throwback playlists. The janitorial position at Kensington Holdings came through a temp agency that specialized in placing people who were overqualified and desperate. The pay was enough to cover rent and food with a thin margin for emergencies. The hours aligned with Lila's school schedule. The health insurance was mediocre but existent. Ethan took it without negotiating, grateful for the chance to be employed rather than the identity of the employment. He dropped Lila at public school 142, 3 blocks from his work, watching her run toward the entrance with her butterfly backpack bouncing against her shoulders. She turned at the door, waved with her whole arm, the gesture so full of joy it hurt. He waved back, throat tight with the knowledge that she was happy, thriving, growing up with security he'd built from the wreckage of their loss. That was enough. It had to be enough. The lobby of Kensington Holdings was a cathedral of wealth marble and steel and glass arranged in proportions designed to make visitors feel small. Ethan entered through the service entrance, a nondescript door between the loading dock and the parking garage, and descended to the basement where the real infrastructure of the building lived. Maintenance staff, custodial crews, security personnel who monitored the cameras, all the people who made the visible world function smoothly, existed in spaces the executives never saw. The break room smelled like every break room in every building he'd ever worked. Industrial cleaning products, an instant coffee, and the particular staleness of air that rarely circulated properly. His cart was waiting where he'd left it the night before, supplies neatly organized in the order he'd need them. Ethan pushed it toward the service elevator, nodding to the overnight security guard who was finishing his shift. The rhythm of the work was meditative, floor by floor, room by room, removing the evidence of human occupation so the next day could begin with the illusion of pristine perfection. He emptied trash bins full of coffee cups and printed emails and the remains of working lunches. He mopped floors that cost more per square foot than his monthly rent. He wiped down conference tables where decisions that affected thousands of lives were made by people who never noticed the man who cleaned up after them. Invisibility was a superpower he'd learned to wield. He could move through spaces, observe without being observed, listen to conversations that happened around him as if he were furniture. Executives complained about their marriages in elevators. Paralegals gossiped about office affairs and restrooms. Interns cried in stairwells about the pressure and the fear of failure. Ethan heard it all, collected the stories without judgment, understanding that everyone was fighting battles that remained invisible to those around them. The building had its own rhythm, its own music. The hum of HVAC systems, the click of heels on marble, the ping of elevator arrivals, the rustle of papers, the murmur of voices conducting business in languages he sometimes recognized and sometimes didn't. Late at night, when most of the staff had gone home and only the truly dedicated or truly desperate remained, he heard other sounds. Piano music from somewhere in the upper floors. Hesitant notes repeated until they smoothed into melody scales practiced with the determination of someone learning. He'd pause sometimes, mop in hand, and close his eyes. Let the sound wash over him, remember what it felt like to work with music as his medium, when his job was to make beautiful things more beautiful, when his contribution mattered in ways that outlasted the moment. The ache of that loss never fully faded, but it had worn smooth over time, become bearable, a stone he carried in his pocket that reminded him of who he used to be. Clara Kensington's mornings began in the silence of the penthouse she'd bought the month after Daniel died. The real estate agent had called it a sanctuary, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park, smart home technology that anticipated needs before they were articulated, finishes selected by an interior designer whose waiting list was measured in years. Clara had paid cash, moved in within a week, and discovered that luxury couldn't fill the emptiness that had taken up residence in her chest. 5 o'clock came with the precision of automation, her phone alarm, a gentle chime that could have been a meditation bell in another life. She silenced it with muscle memory and sat up in bed, feet finding the heated floor, body moving through the routine that structured her days. The treadmill in her private gym faced more windows, more city, more evidence of the empire her family had built and she'd been groomed to inherit. 4 miles at a pace calculated by her trainer to maximize cardiovascular benefit without overtraining. She ran with her mind already engaged in the day ahead, reviewing the talking points for the board meeting, the details of the Tokyo acquisition, the numbers that would either prove her worth or expose her inadequacy. The shower was rainfall temperature controlled to the degree, water pressure calibrated for optimal muscle recovery. Clara stood under it longer than necessary, waiting for the sensation of cleanliness that never quite arrived. No amount of expensive soap washed away the bone-deep exhaustion that had become her baseline. She was 32 but felt ancient, her body maintained through discipline and her face preserved through strategic intervention. The dermatologist said she had excellent bone structure, that she'd age gracefully if she maintained the current regimen. Clara looked at her reflection in the steam-free mirror and saw a stranger wearing her features, someone who'd traded humanity for achievement and was only beginning to understand the terms of that exchange. By 7, she was at her desk on the 45th floor, the city sprawling beneath her in all directions. Reports were waiting in neat stacks organized by her assistant with color-coded tabs that indicated priority. Clara reviewed them with the focus of a general planning campaigns, marking margins with notes that would become directives, signing documents that moved millions of dollars with the stroke of a pen. She approved the London expansion, denied the request for additional staffing in the Berlin office, signed off on the termination of 3 executives whose performances had failed to meet targets. Each decision was supported by data defensible in any review, completely divorced from the human consequences that would ripple outward from her signature. Her assistant brought meals on a schedule determined by a nutritionist. Clara ate at her desk, barely tasting the carefully calibrated balance of protein and vegetables and complex carbohydrates. Food was fuel, nothing more, another metric to be managed in the pursuit of optimal performance. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages that demanded immediate attention. She answered in clipped sentences, 2 words where others would use 10 efficiency, weaponized against the demands on her time. The view from her office showed the city as a pattern of geometry, buildings rising in clusters, streets cutting grids, Central Park a rectangular breath of green in the center of it all. Clara sometimes stood at the window during the brief moments between meetings, looking down at the people who moved like cells through the urban organism, wondering if any of them felt as disconnected from their own lives as she did. The thought passed quickly. Introspection was a luxury she couldn't afford. Time wasted that could be spent solving problems, closing deals, building the legacy her father had entrusted to her before cancer claimed him 3 months after Daniel's plane went down. 3 floors above her office, Emily lived in a suite designed by child psychologists who specialized in trauma recovery. The space was flooded with natural light, filled with toys selected for their developmental benefits, decorated in colors meant to promote calm. There was a bed that looked like a cloud, shelves full of books about feelings and bravery and children who overcame impossible odds. A baby grand piano stood in the corner, its keys rarely touched despite the weekly lessons Clara had arranged with a Juilliard graduate who charged more per hour than most people made in a day. Emily had stopped speaking the day the news reached her. 4 years old at the time, old enough to understand that Daddy was gone, but too young to process that gone meant forever. She'd withdrawn into herself like a snail retreating into its shell, and nothing Clara tried could coax her back out. The first therapist had used play therapy, spending hours trying to engage Emily with dollhouses and art supplies. Emily sat motionless, eyes fixed on nothing, breathing so shallow it barely moved her chest. The second therapist tried talk therapy, gentle questions designed to help Emily process her grief. Emily never responded, never acknowledged the adult presence in the room existed in a pocket of isolation that no technique could penetrate. By the 6th month, Clara had consulted with specialists across the country. Johns Hopkins, Stanford, the Mayo Clinic. Every institution with a reputation for pediatric trauma received calls from her assistant. She flew Emily to appointments in private jets, stayed in hotel suites near the hospitals, sat through evaluations that lasted hours. The diagnoses were consistent. Selective mutism triggered by acute psychological trauma, complicated by unresolved grief and maternal emotional unavailability. That last part was buried in clinical language, but Clara understood what they were saying. Her daughter's silence was at least in part her fault. She'd hired nannies with credentials that read like dissertations, women who'd studied child development at prestigious universities and trained at institutions known for their work with traumatized children. They lasted weeks, sometimes days, before Emily's behavior exhausted their professional patience. She'd lock herself in closets for hours, refusing to come out even for meals. She'd destroy her room in fits of rage that left books torn, toys broken, pillows shredded. She'd stare at adults with eyes that saw through their practiced empathy to the fear beneath the knowledge that they were in over their heads, and no amount of training had prepared them for a child who decided the world was fundamentally unsafe. The tantrums grew worse over time, not better. Emily seemed to be testing the limits of what adults would tolerate, pushing boundaries until they broke, confirming her belief that everyone eventually left. Clara watched this pattern repeat with the helpless understanding that she was failing at the one thing that mattered more than quarterly earnings or market position. She could run a company, but she couldn't reach her own child. The irony was bitter enough to taste. The two worlds, Ethan's and Clara's, existed in the same building, but might as well have occupied different dimensions. Ethan cleaned the lower floors where paralegals worked late, preparing briefs, and interns fetched coffee while simultaneously applying to law school. He learned their routines, noticed when someone stayed later than usual, could read the stress in the way they held their shoulders or the speed of their typing. Sometimes he'd find evidence of small human dramas in the trash bins, tissues wadded from tears-printed emails announcing layoffs, half-eaten lunches from the expensive cafe across the street, where a salad cost more than his weekly grocery budget. He never ventured above the 30th floor. Those spaces were handled by a different crew, people who'd been background checked more thoroughly and signed additional NDAs. The executive levels had their own ecosystem, their own rules. Ethan existed comfortably in his stratum content with the boundaries that kept his life simple and contained. Late evenings, usually around 8 or 9, when the building had emptied enough to create pockets of silence, he heard the piano music. It drifted down through the ventilation system notes that spoke of someone working through pieces with determination rather than joy. He'd stop what he was doing, close his eyes, and listen. The repetition of scales, the careful practice of finger exercises, the occasional attempt at melody that would start and stop and start again. Someone up there was learning the hard way through discipline and persistence rather than natural talent. Ethan recognized the feeling. He'd learned sound engineering the same way, spending hours adjusting EQ curves until his ears understood the relationship between frequency and emotion, practicing until technical knowledge became intuition. Music was a language that required fluency, and fluency required dedication that looked like obsession to people who didn't understand. Whoever was playing that piano was putting in the hours, showing up even when the progress felt invisible. He respected that, felt a kinship with the unknown musician, even though they'd never meet. Clara watched her employees through security monitors because paranoia had become policy after a corporate espionage incident 3 years prior. The cameras covered every public space in the building, feeds monitored by a team that worked in shifts around the clock. Clara had access to the archive, could pull up footage from any camera at any time, and she used this capability more than she wanted to admit. Sometimes late at night, unable to sleep, despite the melatonin in the meditation app and the white noise machine, she'd sit at her desk and watch the building after hours. She saw the cleaning crews working through their routes with practiced efficiency, saw security guards doing rounds, checking doors, verifying that the building was secure, saw the occasional executive who stayed late, their dedication or desperation keeping them at their desks long after reasonable hours. The footage was mundane, repetitive, utterly ordinary. It was also oddly comforting evidence that the world continued functioning according to patterns, even when her own life felt like chaos barely contained. One evening, reviewing footage from the lobby cameras, she saw him, the janitor with the kind face, kneeling beside a small girl in a butterfly backpack, helping her tie her shoe. The image was grainy, the angle distant, but Clara could see the patience in his body language, the gentleness in the way his hands worked the laces. The little girl said something that made him laugh, a sound lost to the silent recording, but visible in the way his shoulders shook and his head tilted back. Then she threw her arms around his neck, the spontaneous affection of a child who trusted completely, and he held her like she was made of something more precious than any material wealth. Clara's chest cracked open, a physical sensation like ice breaking under pressure. She'd forgotten what that looked like, the simple joy of a child who felt safe, the uncomplicated love between a parent and a child. Emily hadn't hugged her voluntarily in 2 years. Every physical contact was initiated by Clara, and tolerated at best, endured more often. The distance between them was measured in Emily's stiff posture, her turned-away face, her body language that screamed rejection even though her mouth stayed silent. She watched the janitor walk away hand in hand with his daughter, their silhouettes disappearing through the service entrance, and felt the weight of everything she'd lost settle more heavily on her shoulders. She didn't know his name, hadn't noticed him among the dozens of maintenance staff who kept the building functional. But she'd remember that image, would find herself returning to it on the footage in the days ahead, searching for evidence that parental joy was still possible, that love could exist without complication. The afternoon that changed everything began like all the others, with Emily refusing to cooperate with the structure Clara had built around her daughter's days. The private tutor arrived at 2 o'clock for the daily academic session, carrying materials designed for gifted children, prepared to work on mathematics and literature and science in ways that accommodated Emily's silence. Emily met her at the door of the suite, looked her directly in the eyes, and slapped the textbooks from her hands. The woman flinched backward, training deserting her in the face of unexpected violence. The nanny, this one was named Margaret, a British woman in her 50s with 30 years of experience and references from families whose names appeared in Forbes, tried to intervene. She used the calm voice recommended by the behavioral specialists, the approach that was supposed to de-escalate conflict through gentle redirection. Emily turned that rage on her, screaming, in a voice that carried despite the soundproofing words that had been locked away for months, spilling out in a torrent of fury. The lunch Clara had carefully selected based on nutritional guidelines and Emily's known preferences hit the wall with enough force to leave a stain. Margaret quit on the spot, her professional composure finally shattered after 3 weeks of trying and failing to connect with a child who actively resisted connection. Clara was in Tokyo via video conference, sitting in her office at 3 a.m. New York time to accommodate the time difference, negotiating the terms of an acquisition that would expand Kensington Holdings into the Asian market. The head of security called her personal line, the one reserved for emergencies that required her immediate attention. Emily had escaped her suite again. They were searching the building. The vice grip of panic that seized Clara's chest was familiar, a regular visitor during Emily's escape attempts. Her daughter had managed to override the electronic locks 3 times in the past 2 months, had learned to time her escapes to coincide with shift changes when security was momentarily distracted. They'd found her in a supply closet on the 18th floor, once curled around a mop bucket, sleeping with the exhaustion of someone who'd run until they couldn't run anymore. Another time she'd made it to the parking garage, been discovered sitting in a Mercedes that belonged to a senior VP pretending to drive. Clara excused herself from the video conference with the Tokyo executives, her reputation for ruthless focus cracking under the weight of maternal fear. She took the stairs instead of waiting for the elevator, her heels echoing in the concrete shaft, her breathing harsh in the enclosed space. 40 minutes passed before security located Emily, each minute stretching into hours of imagination, every possible disaster playing out in Clara's mind. The janitor's break room on the 12th floor was not a place Clara had ever visited, barely a place she'd known existed. It was a narrow space between the elevator shaft and a utility closet furnished with a folding table, 3 mismatched chairs, a microwave that probably predated the building's renovations, and a coffee maker held together with what looked like electrical tape. Emily had burst through the door like a small tornado in a designer dress that cost more than most people's monthly salary, grabbed a mop like it was a sword, her eyes wild with the kind of energy that came from equal parts rage and desperation. Ethan had been reorganizing cleaning supplies, placing bottles in alphabetical order because systems prevented chaos, and chaos was dangerous when you were raising a child alone. The door slammed open, and suddenly there was this tiny person, all fury and fear, wielding his mop, with the determination of someone who'd decided to fight rather than flee. He looked at her, really looked, seeing past the expensive dress and the obvious signs of privilege to the pain underneath. He'd seen that expression on Lila's face during the first year after Sarah died, when his daughter would wake screaming from nightmares and take hours to calm, when she'd lash out at anything that felt like comfort, because comfort was a lie, and the world would take away everyone you loved. His voice came out steady, conversational, not talking down to her, but not treating her like a bomb about to detonate either. "You want to help me clean?" Simple words and offer without pressure, space for her to choose. Emily stopped mid-swing, the mop still raised, her small body vibrating with adrenaline. She stared at him, trying to categorize this adult who wasn't running away or trying to restrain her, who was treating her rage like it was reasonable rather than something to be managed. Ethan pulled a spray bottle and a rag from his cart, his movements slow and deliberate, telegraphing his intentions. "This is the secret technique. You spray 3 times, no more, no less, then you wipe in circles counterclockwise. Very important. The clockwise way doesn't work nearly as well." The absurdity of it penetrated Emily's fury. She lowered the mop slowly, her breathing still rapid but no longer desperate. He offered her the rag, holding it by the corner, giving her the choice to take it or refuse. She took it with tentative fingers, then grabbed the spray bottle with more confidence. She sprayed exactly 3 times, counted out loud, without realizing she was breaking her silence, then wiped in careful counterclockwise circles. The table they were cleaning wasn't particularly dirty, but that didn't matter. What mattered was the ritual, the structure, the way he'd taken her chaos and given it direction without trying to eliminate it. Ethan heated water in the microwave, timing it based on the machine's particular quirks. 90 seconds produced water that was hot enough to melt cocoa powder, but not hot enough to burn small tongues. He mixed in the cocoa and a splash of vanilla extract the way Sarah used to make it, the way that turned something simple into something special. He set the mug in front of Emily with a spoon, let her stir it herself while he leaned against the counter at a distance that was close but not crowding. He told her about Lila, about their morning routine that involved butterfly books and made-up songs, about the way his daughter insisted on wearing mismatched socks because matching was boring. He talked to Emily the way he'd talk to any person, without the careful modulation adults used when they were trying to be therapeutic, without the undertone of pity that children recognize instantly. Emily listened, perched on the folding chair with her legs swinging, her hands wrapped around the warm mug, her expression shifting from guarded to curious to something that almost looked like peace. The cocoa left a small brown mustache on her upper lip. She didn't wipe it away, too focused on the story about Lila's teacher, who looked like a nice witch and always smelled like cinnamon. 20 minutes passed, maybe 30. Time moved differently in that small room, untethered from the urgency that governed the rest of the building. Emily leaned against Ethan's shoulder, a gesture so natural it seemed to surprise them both. She told him about the piano piece she'd been practicing, the one with the scales that her fingers couldn't quite reach, yet the one that was supposed to get easier but still felt impossible. Her voice was soft but clear, rusty from disuse, but functional words spilling out after months of silence, like water finding a crack in a dam. Clara arrived with security in tow, prepared to unleash the fury that came from fear transmuted into authority. She'd run the 3 flights of stairs because waiting for the elevator had been unbearable, her heart pounding from exertion and terror, and the anticipation of finding Emily hurt, or scared, or both. She burst through the door of the break room with words already forming demands and reprimands, and the desperate need to establish control over a situation that had been out of control for far too long. The words died in her throat. Emily was leaning against the janitor's shoulder, holding a mug of what smelled like hot chocolate, talking in a voice Clara hadn't heard in so long. It felt like meeting a stranger. Her daughter's face held an expression Clara didn't recognize at first, because it had been absent for years. Peace. Not happiness exactly, but the kind of calm that comes from feeling safe, from trusting that the immediate moment won't bring disaster. Ethan looked up, saw the CEO standing in the doorway with security flanking her like bodyguards, and understood the situation instantly. The power dynamics, the violation of protocol, the way this moment must look to someone who only saw an employee with her daughter. He shifted gently, carefully, moving Emily upright, without making the gesture feel like rejection. His voice stayed soft, neutral, giving Emily information without judgment. Someone's here to take you home. Emily's face closed like a door slamming shut, every trace of peace vanishing as if it had never existed. The wall came back up, her body tensing her hands, releasing the mug with a kind of resignation that hurt to witness. She stood slowly, her eyes on the floor, transformed back into the silent, angry child who lived behind barriers no one could cross. Clara felt the familiar knife of failure twist in her gut, a sensation so routine it had become almost comfortable. But something had changed, something fundamental. Emily looked back at Ethan as Clara led her away, her small hand engulfed in her mother's grip. That look communicated everything this stranger had given her, something in 20 minutes, that all the money and expertise and desperate love in the world hadn't provided. And now it was being taken away, adding one more loss to a list that was already too long. The walk to the elevator was silent, Emily's feet dragging Clara's chest tight with too many emotions to name. Security dispersed once it was clear the situation was contained, leaving mother and daughter alone in the hallway. Clara wanted to ask what had happened in that break room, wanted to demand explanations and protocols and assurances that this wouldn't become another crisis to manage. But Emily's slumped shoulders and the way she wouldn't meet Clara's eyes silenced those questions. Sometimes the cost of getting what you wanted was losing something you hadn't known you needed. That night, Clara couldn't sleep despite the exhaustion that had settled into her bones, despite the sleeping pills her doctor had prescribed after Daniel died, despite the meditation app that promised deep rest if she just followed the breathing exercises. She sat in her office at 2 a.m, the city spread beneath her like a circuit board lights, tracing patterns that suggested order even when chaos reigned. She pulled up the security footage from the break room, entering the timestamp from earlier in the day, watching the encounter unfold from the perspective of the camera mounted in the corner. The recording had no sound, but she didn't need audio to understand what she was watching. The janitor's body language spoke of patience without agenda. Emily's transformation from rage to trust played out in the gradual relaxation of her shoulders, the way she moved closer to him in incremental shifts, the moment she leaned against his arm like it was the most natural thing in the world. Clara watched him make hot chocolate with the care of someone performing a ritual, watched him talk while giving Emily space to just listen, watched the way he treated her daughter like a person with thoughts worth hearing rather than a problem requiring solution. All the therapists with their frameworks and techniques and published research had approached Emily with the goal of fixing her. This man had simply sat with her, treating her silence as valid rather than something to overcome. Clara, who hadn't cried since Daniel's funeral, who prided herself on emotional control that board members described as ice water in her veins, who'd built a reputation on never showing weakness, sat alone in her office at 2 a.m. and wept. The tears came from somewhere deep and previously untouched, a reservoir of grief she'd sealed away, because acknowledging it would have meant admitting she couldn't hold everything together. She cried for Daniel for the life they'd planned that ended in twisted metal, and smoke for Emily's stolen joy, for her own failure to be enough for the 3 years she'd spent in survival mode while her daughter drowned in silence. The footage looped Emily leaning against this stranger, finding comfort Clara couldn't provide, and the tears wouldn't stop. They soaked into the Italian silk of her blouse, left tracks in the careful makeup she always wore, reduced her to something raw and human, in a way she hadn't allowed since the day she became CEO. When the sky started to lighten toward dawn, when her eyes were swollen and her throat ached, and she'd used every tissue in her desk drawer, she finally felt empty enough to think clearly. The next day, Clara did something she'd never done before in her tenure as CEO. She left her office during work hours without a meeting scheduled, took the service elevator down to the basement level, where the facilities staff gathered, and walked into their world. The fluorescent lights were harsh, the air thick with the smell of cleaning products and machine oil, the space utilitarian in a way that made her executive floor look like a palace by comparison. Ethan was refilling his cart loading supplies in some organizational system that presumably made sense to him, looking tired but content in the way people did when they'd accepted their circumstances and stopped fighting them. He glanced up when Clara approached, his expression neutral, but his body language shifting into a kind of watchful attention that suggested he'd been expecting this encounter. Her voice came out harsher than she intended, the CEO tone she couldn't quite turn off even when she wanted to sound human. "I need to speak with you." He followed her to a small conference room on the ground floor, one of the anonymous spaces used for interviews and depositions and conversations that needed to happen away from the main offices. He stood rather than sitting, maintaining the invisible line between employer and employee, his hands hanging loosely at his sides, waiting for her to begin. Clara got straight to the point because circling around the issue would waste time she didn't have. "My daughter only talks to you. I don't understand why, but I'm offering you a temporary position. Help her communicate. Spend time with her. Just be whatever it is you were yesterday." She paused, then played the card that had solved every problem she'd encountered in business. "I'll triple your current salary." Ethan was quiet for a long moment, his eyes searching her face, looking for something she wasn't sure she was showing. When he spoke, his voice carried the patience of someone who'd learned hard lessons. "With respect, ma'am, you can't buy what your daughter needs." He let that sink in before continuing. "She doesn't need an employee. She needs someone who sees her, not her diagnosis or her difficulties. Someone without an agenda." The words landed like physical blows, precise strikes aimed at Clara's weak points. Her jaw tightened, defensive mechanisms activating, the familiar feeling of control slipping away, triggering her need to reestablish dominance. "Name your price." Ethan's response was simple, delivered without malice or judgment, just stating a truth he'd learned from experience. "There's no price, but if you're asking me to spend time with your daughter, I'll do it. Not for money, because no child should feel as alone as she clearly does." The statement hit harder than criticism, harder than accusation. It acknowledged Emily's pain without making it Clara's fault, offered help without judgment, and in doing so made Clara feel smaller than any hostile takeover or board challenge ever had. He wasn't being cruel, just honest, in a way that people in her world had forgotten how to be. Everyone she dealt with wanted something from her: approval, advancement, money, power, connections. This man was offering to help her daughter for no reason beyond basic human decency, and Clara didn't know how to process that level of altruism because it existed outside her experience. The arrangement caused immediate uproar among the people who made it their business to protect Clara from herself. Senior executives whispered in elevators about the propriety of the CEO bringing a janitor into her daughter's private space. HR submitted concerned memos about liability and protocol and the potential for lawsuits if anything went wrong. The director of security, a former FBI agent who saw threats in every deviation from standard procedure, suggested extensive background checks and liability waivers and a monitoring system that would make the whole arrangement pointless. Clara overrode them all with the blunt instrument of her authority, the same force she used to push through acquisitions and restructures and unpopular decisions that later proved correct. She was the CEO, the primary shareholder, the person Daniel had entrusted with protecting their daughter when he couldn't do it himself. If she wanted to hire the janitor as an unconventional therapist, That was her decision to make, and no one else's to question. Ethan started coming to Emily's suite after his shift ended, arriving around 6:30, with the smell of industrial cleaner still clinging to his work clothes, carrying nothing but the patience he'd learned from single fatherhood. No structured lessons, no therapy techniques, no agenda beyond showing up and being present. He taught her to water the plants on the terrace, explaining how roots needed both water and air to breathe, how you could drown something by loving it too much, how sometimes the best thing you could do was give space and trust the natural process. He showed her how to organize her books by color, turning the chaos of her shelves into rainbow order, making a game of finding spines that matched. They worked in companionable silence, sometimes Emily moving between piles with focus that had been absent from her other activities, Ethan offering gentle guidance when she seemed stuck, but never taking over the task. When they finished, the bookshelf looked like a pride flag, vibrant and orderly, and somehow more cheerful than the expensive interior designer's original arrangement. He brought his guitar, hadn't played in years, but for this he made an exception and taught Emily simple chords. Her fingers were small, struggling to press the strings down, with enough force to create clean notes, but she kept trying with determination that reminded him of the unknown pianist practicing scales late at night. He showed her how to hold her hand, how to use her thumb for leverage, how to accept that it would hurt at first, and eventually calluses would form, and the pain would fade. And he listened. When Emily talked about her father in fits and starts, words coming slow and heavy, Ethan didn't offer platitudes about heaven or time-healing wounds. He just nodded and said what he believed to be true. Missing someone never really stops, but it can become softer, like a stone in your pocket. You always know it's there, but it doesn't cut anymore. Emily understood that in a way she hadn't understood anything the therapist said. The stone metaphor made sense, gave her permission to carry her grief rather than trying to set it down, acknowledged that the pain was permanent but manageable. She asked if he carried a stone, and he said yes, one for his wife, and Emily asked if it still hurt. Sometimes he said, but mostly it just reminds me of what I had, and that's worth carrying. One afternoon, Clara came to collect Emily for their scheduled dinner, one of the few times each week when she blocked her calendar completely and devoted herself to the appearance of normal family life. She arrived at the suite and found Emily asleep on the couch, her head resting on Ethan's shoulder, his arm around her in a protective gesture that looked completely natural. He'd been reading to her from a book about constellations, the hardcover still open on his lap, his voice having finally lulled her into sleep after what had probably been a long day of holding herself together. He looked up when Clara entered, finger to his lips in the universal gesture for silence, and Clara stood frozen in the doorway. Her daughter was sleeping peacefully for the first time in months, maybe years. Not the fitful, nightmare-plagued sleep that had her waking several times a night, but deep rest with her face relaxed and her breathing even. Ethan supported her weight without complaint, his body still. Despite what must have been an uncomfortable position, held for however long Emily had been sleeping. Clara felt something shift inside her chest, a tectonic movement of buried feelings, finding new positions. Not attraction, not yet, that would come later, complicated and unwelcome and inevitable. This was something more fundamental. Recognition. This man had given her daughter what Clara had been desperately searching for, the simple gift of being understood, and in doing so he'd revealed the gap in Clara's own capacity to provide what Emily needed. The image burned itself into Clara's memory. Ethan holding Emily with the gentle competence of someone accustomed to being needed, the book about stars still open, the afternoon light, painting them in shades of gold. It looked like family, looked like safety, looked like all the things Clara had destroyed through her inability to be anything other than efficient and controlled. That evening, after Emily was in bed and the suite was dark except for the glow of the city through the windows, Clara sat in her office and pulled up Ethan's employee file. The information was sparse, the kind of resume that spoke of a life interrupted rather than a career planned. High school graduate, decent grades, but nothing spectacular. Previous employment with a sound production company called Resident Studios left 7 years ago for family circumstances. No college degree, no certifications, no progression of advancement that suggested ambition or drive. She saw the gap in his employment history, the obvious step down from sound engineer to janitor, and understood with the sudden clarity of revelation that he'd sacrificed his career for his child. She'd done the opposite, throwing herself into work after Daniel died, pouring all her energy into the company, because markets didn't die in plane crashes and numbers didn't leave you choking on grief. She'd thought she was protecting Emily by being strong, by maintaining their financial security, by ensuring they'd never want for material things. But she'd been hiding, using work as armor against feelings she couldn't process. The contrast was painful to witness in black and white text on her computer screen. Ethan Cole had chosen his daughter over his calling, had walked away from a career he loved to be present for the person who needed him. Clara Kensington had chosen her career over her daughter, had remained CEO, when every instinct screamed that Emily needed her mother more than the company needed its leader. Neither choice was entirely right or entirely wrong, but seeing them side by side made Clara question everything she'd used to justify her decisions. She closed the employee file and opened her desk drawer, pulled out the bottle of whiskey she kept for closing deals, poured 2 fingers into a crystal glass. The burn was familiar, welcome a different kind of pain than the emotional variety. She stood at the window and looked down at the city, at the thousands of windows glowing with thousands of lives, and wondered how many other people were making impossible choices, sacrificing one thing to save another living, with the consequences of decisions that had seemed necessary at the time. Somewhere in that building, 43 floors below, Ethan was probably taking the subway back to Queens, riding with other exhausted workers whose shifts had ended, going home to a small apartment where his daughter waited to tell him about her day. He'd make dinner from whatever was cheap at the grocery store, listen to Lila with the attention Clara could never quite manage to give Emily, and fall asleep on a pull-out couch after reading bedtime stories. It was a small life by Clara's standards, a life constrained by financial limitations and single parenthood and the absence of the career he'd once pursued with passion. But it was also a full life, rich with connection and presence and the kind of daily intimacy that made a child feel seen. Clara had money and power and influence, lived in a penthouse that cost more than most people earned, in a lifetime, controlled decisions that affected thousands of employees and millions of dollars. But she couldn't make her daughter smile, couldn't navigate the emotional terrain of grief and healing, couldn't bridge the gap between them that grew wider, despite all her resources. She finished the whiskey, set the glass down harder than intended, heard it crack, but not shatter. The fracture ran through the crystal like a lightning bolt, frozen in time, beautiful in its way, evidence that even expensive things broke when handled with too much force. Clara traced the line with her finger and thought about all the ways she'd tried to force solutions, all the times she'd brought power to problems that required tenderness. Ethan was teaching her something without meaning to, showing her through his interactions with Emily that love couldn't be managed like a quarterly report or strategized like an acquisition. It required presence without agenda, patience without timeline, the willingness to sit with discomfort and trust that growth happened in its own time. These were lessons Clara had never learned, skills her education and career had actively trained out of her in favor of efficiency and decisive action. She picked up her phone, thought about texting her assistant to cancel tomorrow's meetings, thought about spending the day with Emily without checking email or taking calls. The impulse died before she could act on it, killed by the weight of responsibility and the fear that she'd already destroyed too much trust to rebuild. What would she even do with Emily for an entire day? What did other mothers do with their 7-year-olds? The question revealed the depth of her failure, the gap in knowledge that should have been automatic, but instead felt like navigating foreign territory without a map. The glass with its cracks sat on her desk, still functional, despite the damage still holding the shape of what it had been. Clara left it there, a reminder that broken things could still serve their purpose, that fractures didn't necessarily mean failure. Tomorrow she'd return to the office, handle the crises that arose with her characteristic efficiency, maintain the facade of control that everyone expected. But tonight, in the quiet hours before dawn, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of what she'd lost and what she might never be able to recover. Down in Queens, in an apartment where the radiator clanged and the walls were paper thin, Ethan Cole tucked his daughter into bed and kissed her forehead with the tenderness of someone who knew how fragile life was, how quickly everything could change. Lila mumbled something about butterflies and rainbows, already half asleep, trusting completely that tomorrow would come and her father would be there. He stood in the doorway watching her breathe, feeling the familiar ache of love mixed with terror, knowing that every day he kept her safe was a small miracle built on sacrifice and stubbornness and faith that he was doing enough. The subway ride home had been quiet, just Ethan and a few other exhausted workers who understood that some things didn't require conversation. He thought about Emily, about the progress she was making, about the responsibility of being the person a traumatized child had decided to trust. It was heavier than he'd expected, this weight of being needed by someone else's daughter, while simultaneously trying to be enough for his own. But he couldn't walk away, not when Emily looked at him with eyes that asked without words if he'd be another person who left. He pulled out his guitar after Lila was asleep, sat on the pull-out couch that was still folded into furniture, and played the melody Sarah used to sing. His fingers found the chords by memory muscle, memory that survived the years of not playing, and he hummed the tune that had drifted through ventilation shafts to reach a little girl's ears. The notes filled the small apartment, competing with the sound of sirens outside and arguments through the walls, creating a pocket of peace in the middle of urban chaos. He thought about Clara Kensington, about the way she'd looked at him when he'd said she couldn't buy what her daughter needed, about the crack in her professional facade that revealed someone desperate and scared beneath the authority. She reminded him of Sarah in those final weeks, fighting for control over a situation that had already spun beyond control, terrified of admitting she couldn't save what she loved most. He'd learned then that sometimes the bravest thing was letting go of the illusion of power and accepting help, accepting limitation, accepting that you couldn't fix everything no matter how hard you tried. The guitar string snapped suddenly, a sharp twang that startled him back to present awareness. The high E string corroded from years of disuse and the cheap strings he'd bought at a pawn shop. He should replace them all, invest in decent equipment if he was going to keep playing for Emily. But decent strings cost money that was budgeted elsewhere for Lila's school supplies and winter coat, and the 1,000 small expenses that added up to raising a child alone. Ethan set the guitar aside, added string replacement to the mental list of things he'd get to eventually, and unfolded the couch into its sleeping position. The mechanism protested with metallic squeals, springs singing their complaint, but it functioned. Everything in his life functioned, barely held together by resourcefulness and determination, and the stubborn refusal to let circumstances become an excuse for giving up. He lay down in the dark, listening to Lila's steady breathing from the bedroom, and felt the familiar mix of exhaustion and gratitude that came with another day survived another night. His daughter slept safe. The stone in his pocket, metaphorical but no less real, shifted with familiar weight. Sarah's absence was a constant presence woven into everything he did, every choice he made. She would have loved Emily, would have known exactly how to reach a grieving child, because she'd understood that music was really just organized emotion. That connection happened through vulnerability, not strength. He carried her forward, the only way he knew how, by trying to embody the compassion she'd shown so naturally, by refusing to let grief make him hard when she'd been so soft. Sleep came eventually, the dreamless exhaustion of someone who'd learned to shut off their mind when necessary. Tomorrow would bring another early alarm, another routine of braiding hair and making breakfast, another subway ride to a building where he existed in spaces the executives never saw. But it would also bring another evening with Emily, another chance to help a child learn that trust was still possible, that adults could be reliable, that grief didn't have to be navigated alone. In her penthouse, Clara finally turned away from the window, left the cracked glass on her desk, and moved toward her bedroom with steps heavy with accumulated fatigue. She didn't undress, just lay down on top of the covers in her work clothes, staring at the ceiling, where shadows played patterns she couldn't interpret. Sleep would be elusive, haunted by images of her daughter's face closing off when Ethan said someone was there to take her home, by the sound of Emily's voice. After months of silence, by the recognition that she'd failed at the one thing that mattered more than anything else. The city hummed with its constant background noise, sirens, and traffic, and the collective sound of 8 million lives being lived simultaneously. Clara let it wash over her, found no comfort in the reminder that her suffering was just one thread in a vast tapestry of human experience. Her pain was specific, personal, earned through choices that had seemed right at the time but looked increasingly wrong with the benefit of hindsight. She thought about Daniel, really thought about him for the first time in months. Not the sanitized memory she maintained for public consumption, but the real person who'd balanced her ruthlessness with dreams, who'd wanted to use their wealth to change lives, who'd been planning a foundation to support music education in underfunded schools before his plans ended in fire and metal and horrified phone calls from aviation officials. He would have known what to do with Emily, would have sat with her in silence until she was ready to speak, would have given her what she needed without having to strategize it like a business problem. The guilt was crushing, familiar the weight she carried in her own pocket that never got lighter. She'd survived when Daniel didn't. She'd chosen to stay CEO when Emily needed her mother. She'd built empire instead of family, maintained control instead of allowing mess, and the cost was becoming too clear to ignore. Emily was healing because of a janitor who cleaned toilets and took the subway home, who had nothing but offered everything, while Clara, with all her resources, couldn't provide what her daughter desperately needed. Tomorrow she'd see Ethan in Emily's suite, watch him interact with her daughter, with the ease Clara had never achieved, feel the mix of gratitude and inadequacy, and something else she didn't want to name. Tomorrow she'd return to being CEO, making decisions that moved markets and changed lives, wielding power that made grown men nervous. But tonight, in the dark hours that belonged to truth instead of performance, she could admit that she'd failed at the thing that mattered most, and no amount of professional success would ever fill that particular void. The building settled around her with creaks and groans, the sound of a structure adjusting to temperature changes, expanding and contracting in ways too subtle for most occupants to notice. Clara listened to it like a language, trying to find meaning in the random noises, trying to distract herself from the loop of thoughts that wouldn't let her rest. Somewhere in this same building, separated by floors and class and choices, Ethan had shown her what love looked like when it wasn't complicated by wealth or guilt or the need to perform perfection. And Clara, who'd spent her entire adult life believing she knew how the world worked, was learning that some lessons required humility she'd never been taught to access. The night stretched toward dawn, measured in the gradual shift of shadows and the slow evolution of city sounds from nightlife to early morning traffic. Clara never quite slept, hovering in that space between waking and rest, where thoughts became dreams, became fears, became memories, all tangled together. When her alarm finally sounded at 5, she silenced it with relief, grateful for the permission to stop pretending sleep was possible and return to the role where she knew the rules and could maintain control. But something had changed in that long night of forced introspection. Some small shift in her foundation, hairline crack in the armor she'd built around herself. She couldn't name it yet, didn't fully understand it, but she felt it like a stone in her own pocket, constant weight reminding her that the path she'd chosen wasn't the only path available, that change was still possible, even when it felt impossible, that surrender wasn't the same as defeat. She rose with the practiced efficiency of routine, started at the coffee maker, stood at the window watching the city wake up. But for the first time in 3 years, she allowed herself to imagine a different future, one where she wasn't defined solely by quarterly reports and market position, where her daughter's voice filled rooms instead of silence, where she learned from a janitor how to be human again. It was a small seed of possibility, easily crushed, fragile as new growth. But it was there, planted in the darkness, waiting to see if it would be nurtured or abandoned. 2 weeks into the arrangement, Emily laughed at something Ethan said about his failed attempt to cook pancakes that had somehow turned into rubber frisbees. The sound stopped Clara mid-step in the hallway outside the suite. She stood frozen, hand on the doorframe, listening to her daughter's laughter ring through the space like music from an instrument she'd forgotten existed. When was the last time Emily had laughed? Clara couldn't remember, couldn't pinpoint a specific moment, and that absence of memory felt like indictment. She entered quietly, not wanting to break whatever spell had created this miracle. Ethan and Emily were sitting cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by sheets of paper covered in crayon drawings. Emily was illustrating a story. Ethan was telling something about a butterfly who was afraid of heights, and her small hands moved with focus that had been absent from every other activity the expensive therapist had attempted. Ethan glanced up, registered Clara's presence, but didn't change his tone or shift his attention from Emily. He continued the story, letting the narrative build towards some resolution that would make sense to a 7-year-old's understanding of courage. Emily added wings to her drawing, coloring them in careful strokes that stayed mostly within the lines. When Ethan finished, she held up her picture with pride that transformed her features into something Clara barely recognized: her daughter before the crash, before grief carved channels through her childhood. Clara's chest tightened with emotion she couldn't quite categorize. Gratitude, certainly. Relief that Emily was emerging from her shell. But underneath those surface feelings lived something more complicated, something that tasted like jealousy and shame mixed together. A stranger had accomplished what Clara couldn't. A man who cleaned toilets for minimum wage had reached her daughter in ways all her money and desperation had failed to achieve. That evening after Ethan left and Emily was preparing for bed, Clara sat on the edge of her daughter's mattress with the kind of careful proximity that characterized all their interactions. Emily didn't pull away, which felt like progress, but she didn't lean in either. The space between them measured the distance they'd traveled and the distance that remained. Clara's voice came out softer than her usual executive timbre. "I'm glad Mr. Cole is helping you. He seems very kind." Emily nodded, fingers picking at the edge of her blanket, not quite meeting Clara's eyes. Words formed slowly, testing whether it was safe to speak truth. "He listens different. Not like he's waiting for me to be done so he can fix me. He just listens." The observation cut deep because it was accurate. Clara had approached Emily's silence as a problem requiring solution, had hired experts to diagnose and treat, rather than simply being present with her daughter's pain. She'd applied her business acumen to parenting, strategized healing like it was a merger to be executed, and in doing so had missed the fundamental truth that Emily needed witness, not management. Clara wanted to say she'd listen that way too, wanted to promise she'd be different, but the words felt hollow before they even formed. She'd already proven what kind of listener she was: efficient, solution-oriented, uncomfortable with the messy meandering that real emotion required. Changing that would require more than good intentions. It would require becoming someone she'd spent her entire adult life learning not to be. Instead, she brushed Emily's hair back from her forehead, a gesture that felt clumsy despite its simplicity. "I love you. I hope you know that even when I'm not very good at showing it." Emily's eyes finally met hers, and in that brief moment of connection, Clara saw the child her daughter used to be and the child she might become if given enough time and support. Then Emily's gaze slid away. The moment passed, but it had existed. That had to count for something. The whispers started small, the way poison usually does, subtle enough to ignore until the damage had already spread through the system. Clara first noticed them in the elevator conversations that stopped abruptly when she entered, executives exchanging glances that carried meaning she wasn't meant to interpret. She dismissed it initially as typical corporate paranoia, the kind of political maneuvering that accompanied any leadership position. But the pattern intensified. During the weekly board meeting, Marcus Harris asked pointed questions about her schedule, whether she was spending adequate time on strategic priorities, whether recent distractions might be affecting her judgment. The word distractions landed with emphasis that suggested he meant something specific. Clara shut him down with the force of her authority, but the seed had been planted, doubt introduced into spaces where her competence had previously gone unquestioned. Her assistant mentioned carefully, diplomatically, that certain board members had been asking questions about Emily's care arrangements, about whether it was appropriate for non-credentialed staff to have access to the CEO's child, about liability concerns and optics. Clara recognized the language of corporate coup disguised as concern for her well-being. Marcus was making his move, leveraging her vulnerability around Emily to undermine her position. She called him into her office the next morning, closed the door with enough force that the glass walls trembled in their frames. They stood on opposite sides of her desk, two apex predators assessing threat levels, years of suppressed rivalry crystallizing into open conflict. Marcus spoke first, his voice carrying the practiced reasonableness of someone who'd rehearsed this confrontation. "The board is concerned, Clara. You're spending significant time on personal matters while the Tokyo acquisition requires your full attention. People are starting to question your priorities." Clara's response came with surgical precision. "My priorities are none of your concern. My performance speaks for itself. Revenue is up 37% since I took over. We've expanded into 3 new markets. Every metric that matters shows this company thriving under my leadership." He leaned forward slightly, dropping the reasonable facade. "But for how long you're letting a janitor spend unsupervised time with your daughter? You're making decisions based on emotion rather than logic." The Clara Kensington I knew wouldn't compromise company reputation for personal convenience. The implication hung between them, that she was becoming weak, that motherhood had softened her edge, that her judgment was compromised by feelings rather than grounded in the ruthless calculation that had made her CEO. It was a narrative designed to resonate with the old guard on the boardmen who'd always been slightly uncomfortable with a woman in the top position who'd voted for her because her father had groomed her, but who'd never fully accepted that she belonged there. Clara's voice dropped to the register she used for threats rather than warnings. "If you're planning to challenge my position, Marcus, have the courage to do it directly rather than whispering poison in board members' ears. But understand, I've built relationships you can't touch, deliver results you can't match, and I will destroy any attempt to undermine me. He smiled, the expression never reaching his eyes. I'm not challenging you, Clara. I'm trying to protect you from yourself. Emily needs stability. You need to focus. Letting this janitor become so involved with your family is a distraction that benefits no one. The meeting ended without resolution, both of them understanding that battle lines had been drawn, and the real fight would happen in boardrooms, in private conversations, through whisper campaigns and strategic alliances. Clara watched him leave his confident stride, suggesting he believed he had leverage. She didn't. He was wrong, but explaining why would require revealing vulnerabilities she'd never shown to anyone at Kensington Holdings. That evening, Ethan arrived at Emily's suite to find Clara still there, pacing near the windows, with tension visible in every line of her body. Emily was at her piano picking out notes from the piece she'd been practicing, absorbed enough not to notice the adult stress filling the room. Ethan set down his bag, took in Clara's expression, and understood that something had shifted in the delicate balance they'd established. Clara's voice was tight, controlled, but the emotion underneath leaked through despite her best efforts. There are people who think this arrangement is inappropriate, who believe you're a distraction from more important priorities. She paused, struggling with the admission. They might be right. Ethan absorbed this information without visible reaction, his expression neutral in the way of people who'd learned not to show fear to those with power over their employment. You want me to stop coming? It wasn't a question, but Clara answered anyway. She stopped, rephrased. I need to protect Emily from becoming collateral damage in board politics. If spending time with you makes her a target for people trying to undermine me, then maybe we need to reconsider. Emily's hands stilled on the piano keys, her small body tensing with the awareness that adult conversations about her life were happening in her presence. She'd learned to recognize the warning signs, the tones that preceded abandonment, disguised as necessary change. Ethan crossed to the piano, sat beside Emily on the bench, his presence solid and reassuring. His voice was gentle but clear enough for Clara to hear. Sometimes people get scared of things they don't understand. It makes them want to stop those things rather than trying to understand them better. But that doesn't mean the thing they're scared of is bad. Emily turned to look at him, searching his face for reassurance that this wasn't another goodbye disguised as explanation. Are you leaving? The directness of children cut through adult equivocation like surgical instruments through tissue. Ethan glanced at Clara, saw the conflict playing out in her features, then returned his attention to Emily. That's not my choice to make, but I promise I won't leave without saying goodbye properly. No one is going to disappear on you the way your father did. The words hit Clara like accusation, even though Ethan's tone carried no judgment. Emily's trauma stemmed from sudden loss from Daniel leaving for London and never returning, from learning that the world was unpredictable and people you loved could vanish without warning. Every therapist Clara had fired, every nanny who quit, every failed attempt at connection reinforced that core wound. And now Clara was considering doing it again, removing Ethan from Emily's life because board politics made her nervous. She sat down heavily on the couch, her usual perfect posture collapsing into something more human. I don't know what the right answer is. I've spent my entire career making impossible decisions, choosing between bad options and worse ones. But this, she gestured helplessly at Emily and Ethan, together at the piano. This matters more than anything else I've ever decided, and I'm terrified of choosing wrong. Ethan's response came after a long pause, words selected with the care of someone who understood their weight. Fear is just energy with nowhere to go. You need to give it a path. He'd said this before the night of Emily's panic attack, but now he turned it toward Clara. What are you more afraid of, people talking about you or Emily going back to how she was before? The question reframed everything, stripped away the corporate politics and social judgment to reveal the fundamental choice underneath. Clara could protect her reputation, maintain her image as the unshakable CEO who never let personal matters interfere with professional responsibilities. Or she could protect her daughter, accept the criticism and speculation, and trust that Emily's healing mattered more than board approval. She met Ethan's eyes, saw the challenge there, the invitation to choose courage over comfort. Stay, please. I'll handle Marcus and the board. Emily needs you. The storm that had been building all afternoon finally broke just after 8 o'clock. The weather service had issued warnings about severe thunderstorms, but Manhattan got those warnings regularly, and mostly they meant heavy rain that snarled traffic and made umbrellas useless against sideways wind. Clara had dismissed the alerts focused on preparing for tomorrow's emergency board meeting where she'd have to defend her decision to maintain Ethan's arrangement with Emily. The first crack of thunder shook the building with enough force to rattle windows. Emily, who'd been getting ready for bed, froze mid-step, her face drained of color, eyes going wide with the particular terror of someone whose worst trauma was being triggered by sensory experience. Lightning followed, illuminating her room in stark white light that made shadows leap across walls like grasping hands. Clara moved toward her daughter, arms outstretched, but Emily backed away. The second thunderclap came closer, louder, the storm directly overhead now. Emily's breathing accelerated into hyperventilation, her small chest heaving with panic that overrode rational thought. She started clawing at her own arms, fingernails leaving red marks, trying to ground herself through physical sensation when psychological grounding had become impossible. The on-call psychiatrist was 30 minutes away, caught in traffic that had frozen under the downpour. Clara tried to hold Emily, but her daughter fought like she was drowning, like Clara's arms were restraints rather than comfort. Every therapeutic technique Clara had memorized failed against the overwhelming force of Emily's panic. Her daughter was disappearing into trauma, reliving the storm that had killed her father, and Clara was powerless to pull her back. Then Ethan appeared in the doorway, soaked from rain, still wearing his work clothes. He'd been leaving the building when the storm hit, had heard the thunder, and known instantly what it would do to Emily. He'd run back through weather that was rapidly becoming dangerous, taken the stairs because the elevator felt too slow, arrived at the suite drenched and breathing hard. He didn't ask permission or wait for invitation. He sat on the floor next to Emily, who was now curled into a ball, and started counting. His voice cut through her panic with steady rhythm, numbers becoming lifeline. 1, 2, 3, 4. He drew out each number, giving them weight and space. Breathe in for 4 counts. Emily, listen to my voice. 1, 2, 3, 4. Emily's eyes found his, wild and terrified, but focused on something outside the panic. He matched his breathing to the counts, exaggerating the inhale and exhale so she could see and hear the pattern. Now hold. 2, 3, 4, and out. 2, 3, 4. Slowly and possibly, Emily's breathing began to synchronize with his rhythm. Her chest still heaved, but the pattern was emerging from chaos. Another crash of thunder made her flinch, but Ethan's voice didn't waver. That's it. In through your nose. 1, 2, 3, 4. You're safe. I'm right here. Hold 2, 3, 4. He started humming the lullaby, the one that had reached her through ventilation shafts that first day, weaving it between the counting. The melody and numbers created a structure her panic could follow, giving her traumatized nervous system something to organize around. Clara knelt beside them, tears streaming down her face, watching Ethan do what she couldn't reach her daughter in the middle of terror and guide her back to safety. Minutes passed, maybe 5 or 10 or 20. Time lost meaning in the intensity of the moment. Emily's breathing gradually steadied, the 4-4-4 pattern becoming automatic. Her fingernails stopped clawing at her arms. The wild look in her eyes faded into exhaustion. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the city, but inside this small circle on the floor, calm was slowly being reconstructed from the wreckage of panic. Clara placed her hand over Emily's, and for the first time, her daughter didn't pull away. The three of them stayed there on the floor as the storm raged, Ethan's voice steady as gravity. Emily's breathing gradually returning to normal, Clara's walls finally crumbling completely. When Emily fell asleep, finally overwhelmed by exhaustion, Ethan carried her to bed with practiced gentleness. Clara followed, watching him tuck her daughter in with the care she'd never quite mastered, despite all her love and desperate trying. They stood in the darkened bedroom, listening to Emily's sleep-deepened breathing before moving to the main room, where the city lights reflected off rain-slicked windows. Clara poured whiskey into 2 glasses, expensive single malt she usually saved for celebrations, and handed one to Ethan. He took it, but didn't drink, just held the glass like it was something breakable. Clara's voice came out raw, stripped of its usual authority. How did you know to do that? Ethan studied the amber liquid, organizing thoughts before speaking. My wife used to have panic attacks during the difficult pregnancy. The doctors couldn't give her medication without risking the baby, so we learned other methods. Box breathing, 4 counts, in 4 hold, 4 out, 4 hold. It resets the nervous system, gives the body something to focus on besides the panic. He paused, taking a small sip. Fear is just energy with nowhere to go. You have to give it a path. Clara looked at him, really looked at him for the first time, not as an employee or a solution to her problem, but as a person who understood pain and had learned to carry it with grace. He was tired, his work clothes still damp, his face showing the strain of sprinting through a storm. But his eyes held depths she hadn't noticed before, the kind of compassion that came from surviving loss without letting it make you hard. She felt something shift in her chest, a tectonic movement of emotion she wasn't ready to acknowledge. This wasn't gratitude anymore, wasn't simple appreciation for someone helping her daughter. This was recognition of the kind that happens when you meet someone who sees through your armor to the scared, struggling human underneath. The moment stretched between them, loaded with things neither could say. Then Ethan set down his glass, stepped back, reestablishing the professional distance that had been erased by crisis. I should go. Make sure Emily stays asleep. If she wakes up panicking again, remember the 4 counts. Don't try to stop the fear, just give it structure. Clara walked him to the door, struggling with the urge to ask him to stay, to keep talking, to explain how he'd become so necessary to her life in such a short time. But the words wouldn't form, trapped behind years of learning not to need anyone, not to show vulnerability, not to ask for help that might be denied. At the threshold, Ethan turned back. She's going to be okay. It takes time, but kids are more resilient than we give them credit for. Just keep showing up even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. After he left, Clara sat alone in the silent suite, listening to rain hammer the windows. She thought about Daniel, about the kind of father he'd been before the crash ended everything. Gentle where she was rigid, patient where she was demanding, comfortable with the mess and chaos of raising a child, where Clara needed order and control. He would have handled the panic attack with the same calm Ethan had shown, would have known instinctively how to reach Emily when she was drowning in fear. But Daniel was gone, had been gone for 3 years, and Clara was still learning how to be enough for the daughter they'd created together. Ethan was teaching her, showing her through example what parenting looked like when it wasn't about control or achievement, but about presence and patience, and the willingness to sit with discomfort until it passed. She checked on Emily, found her sleeping, deeply face peaceful, in the way it rarely was, even in rest. Clara sat on the edge of the bed, brushed hair back from her daughter's forehead, and whispered promises she wasn't sure she could keep, that she'd be better, more present, more capable of giving Emily what she needed, that she wouldn't let board politics or corporate reputation or her own fear of vulnerability get in the way of her daughter's healing. The next morning, Marcus Harris called an emergency board meeting. Clara entered the conference room knowing this was the confrontation he'd been building toward, the moment he had tried to use her personal life as evidence of compromised judgment. The board members sat around the table, their faces carefully neutral, waiting to see how this would unfold. Marcus stood at the head of the table, presentation already loaded on the screen behind him. Thank you all for coming on short notice. I've called this meeting because I believe we need to address concerns about leadership stability and the potential liability exposure from unconventional childcare arrangements. Clara remained standing near the door, arms crossed, every line of her body language, communicating that she wasn't intimidated. Marcus clicked to the first slide, and Clara's stomach dropped. It was a photo-grainy security camera footage of Ethan carrying Emily to bed the night before Clara, following close behind the 3 of them in a tableau that could be interpreted a dozen different ways, depending on the viewer's agenda. Marcus's voice carried false concern layered over triumph. The CEO is allowing uncredentialed, unvetted staff members unsupervised access to her traumatized child. Furthermore, background investigation reveals that Ethan Cole isn't quite the simple janitor he appears to be. Another click. Ethan's previous employment history appeared, but highlighted sections suggested something more sinister than a career interrupted by family tragedy. Marcus continued building his case. Cole worked at Resonance Studios, which coincidentally recorded an album for Daniel Kensington's charity foundation 5 years before the plane crash. He was present during sessions where Daniel was in the studio. This isn't a random janitor who happened to connect with Emily. This is someone with prior connection to the Kensington family who has positioned himself. Clara's voice cut through his presentation like steel through paper. Stop talking. The room went silent. Clara moved to the center of the table, placed both hands flat on the polished surface and locked eyes with Marcus. When she spoke, her voice carried the full force of authority she'd earned through brutal competence and strategic brilliance. Let me be absolutely clear. My daughter suffered selective mutism for 2 years. 2 years of the most expensive therapists, the most qualified specialists, the most prestigious treatment programs, all failures. Then Ethan Cole, who you want to paint as some kind of opportunist, reached her in a single afternoon. Not through manipulation or hidden agenda, but through basic human decency and patience. She straightened her gaze, sweeping the board members who sat watching this internal war. You want to question my judgment? My performance speaks for itself. Revenue up 37%, 3 successful market expansions. Every metric that matters shows this company thriving. But more importantly, my daughter is speaking again. She's laughing again. She's learning to trust again. Clara pulled out her phone, pulled up footage from the night before. Not the camera angle Marcus had cherry-picked, but different views showing the full context: Emily's panic attack, Ethan's emergency intervention, the breathing technique that had saved her daughter from drowning in trauma. She cast it to the conference room screen, forcing them all to watch. That is what you want me to sacrifice for optics, for corporate politics, for the comfort of board members who've never had to make impossible choices between company and family. The footage played out, Emily's terror visible even in security camera grain, Ethan's calm intervention, Clara's desperate gratitude. When it ended, silence filled the room like water flooding a sinking ship. Marcus tried to recover. Clara, no one is suggesting. She cut him off again. Yes, you are. You're suggesting I choose between being CEO and being a mother, between company reputation and my daughter's well-being. And I'm telling you I choose her. Every time. If that compromises my position in your eyes, then vote me out. But understand that I will fight you with everything I have, and I will win. The threat hung in the air, tangible as smoke. Clara had relationships Marcus couldn't touch, leverage he didn't understand, and the willingness to burn it all down if they tried to use Emily as a weapon against her. The board members shifted uncomfortably, recognizing that this confrontation had just escalated beyond corporate maneuvering into something more personal and potentially more destructive. The chairman, a man in his 70s who'd served under Clara's father, cleared his throat. I think we've heard enough. Clara, your position isn't in question. Marcus, your concerns are noted, but ultimately, this is a personal matter that doesn't affect company performance. He looked pointedly at Marcus. Unless there's actual evidence of wrongdoing rather than speculation, I suggest we move on to actual business. Marcus sat down slowly, his play blocked but not defeated. He'd lost this battle, but the war would continue through whispers and insinuations, through gradual erosion of confidence rather than direct assault. Clara knew this wasn't over, but she'd won the day. That would have to be enough. After the meeting, she returned to her office and called Ethan. He answered on the third ring, his voice carrying street noise in the background. He was outside somewhere, probably on break between cleaning assignments. Clara's words came out in a rush, urgent and unfiltered. Marcus knows about your connection to Daniel. He's trying to make it look like you engineered this whole thing, that you had some agenda beyond just helping Emily. Silence on the other end, long enough that Clara wondered if the call had dropped. Then Ethan's voice, careful but honest. I did meet your husband once. He came to the studio during a recording session for his foundation's benefit album. We talked for maybe 10 minutes about sound quality and acoustics. I didn't even remember it until Marcus's people must have dug through old records. He paused, then continued. If my connection to Daniel makes this harder for you, I understand. I can step back. Emily's made enough progress that maybe she doesn't need me anymore. Clara's response came without hesitation. She needs you. I need... She stopped, rephrased. This arrangement stays. I'll handle Marcus and anyone else who has a problem with it. Another pause, then Ethan's quiet acknowledgement. Okay, I'll see you tonight then. After they hung up, Clara sat at her desk, staring at the city below, feeling the weight of decisions that would ripple forward in ways she couldn't fully predict. She'd just chosen her daughter over corporate politics, had drawn a line that might cost her everything she'd built. But watching Emily sleep peacefully after the panic attack, seeing her daughter's face light up when Ethan arrived, hearing her laugh again, that was worth any professional cost. The stone in her pocket had shifted, changed shape. The grief over Daniel was still there, but it was making room for something new, something that felt dangerously like hope. And Clara, who'd spent 3 years learning to live without hope, wasn't sure if she was ready for what might come next. The photographer started appearing in the third week, lurking outside Kensington Holdings with long lenses pointed at the service entrance. Someone had leaked Ethan's schedule to the tabloids, and now his morning arrivals were documented like celebrity sightings. The headlines started small gossip sites that nobody took seriously but gained traction as the story spread. Billionaire CEO's secret romance with building janitor led to speculation that grew more invasive with each iteration. Ethan first noticed them on a Tuesday morning, 3 men with cameras waiting near the subway exit. They didn't approach, just clicked shutters as he walked past with Lila's hand in his. His daughter looked up confused by the attention, and he pulled her closer. By the time he reached the building, his phone was buzzing with messages from coworkers who'd seen the photos online, their texts ranging from curious to concerned to crudely congratulatory. The attention escalated. Reporters showed up at Lila's school asking teachers about Ethan's fitness as a parent, digging for any story angle that would feed the public's appetite for scandal. Someone obtained his employment records, published details about his salary and living situation, painting a picture designed to suggest gold-digging opportunism rather than genuine connection. The internet did what the internet does, created narratives from fragments, judged situations they didn't understand, turned real people into characters in a story that existed purely for entertainment. Clara's legal team sent cease and desist letters, threatened lawsuits, but the damage was spreading faster than they could contain it. Every photo of Ethan entering the building became evidence of an inappropriate relationship. Every moment he spent with Emily was reframed as suspicious rather than therapeutic. The court of public opinion had rendered its verdict without trial, and appeals were impossible once the mob had decided on guilt. Ethan's coworkers started treating him differently. Some with envy, some with suspicion, all with the awareness that he'd become something other than just another custodial worker. The easy camaraderie of the break room vanished, replaced by careful conversations that stopped when he entered. He understood their discomfort. His presence made everyone wonder if they were being watched, if associating with him would somehow pull them into the scandal. The breaking point came when Lila was followed home from school by a reporter who shouted questions about whether her daddy had a new girlfriend, whether Emily was going to be her sister, invasive speculation that sent his daughter into tears. Ethan filed a police report, but the officer who took his statement looked at him with barely concealed judgment, like he'd brought this on himself by reaching above his station. That night, after Lila finally fell asleep clutching her stuffed rabbit, with the intensity of someone seeking safety in familiar things, Ethan sat at his kitchen table and made the decision he'd been avoiding. He pulled out a piece of paper, an actual physical piece of paper, because some things required the weight of handwriting, and composed a letter to Emily. The words came slowly, each sentence requiring multiple attempts before it felt right. He explained that sometimes people got scared of things they didn't understand, that their fear made them want to destroy what they couldn't control. He told her this wasn't her fault, wasn't about her at all, but about adults who couldn't see past their own limitations. He promised she was stronger than she knew, that the progress she'd made was hers to keep. That trust was still possible, even when people had to leave. The hardest part was the ending. He wanted to promise he'd come back, but promises required certainty he didn't possess. Instead, he wrote that some people came into your life for a season rather than forever, and that was okay because the impact they made didn't disappear just because the person did. He signed it simply, Ethan, and folded the paper with care that felt ceremonial. The next evening, he showed up at Clara's office instead of Emily's suite. She was alone, working late as usual, the city lights framing her silhouette against the window. She turned when he entered, and something in her expression suggested she'd been expecting this conversation without wanting it to arrive. Ethan stood near the door, maintaining distance that felt both respectful and final. "I'm leaving, tonight. Taking Lila to my sister's place upstate for a while, maybe longer." Clara's jaw tightened, the muscle jumping with tension she couldn't quite hide. "Running proves their narrative, makes it look like you have something to hide." His voice carried the weight of decisions already made, the arguments already processed and rejected. "Staying destroys yours. Every day I'm here, Marcus gains ammunition. The board gets more nervous. Shareholders start questioning your judgment. And worst of all," he paused, making sure she heard this part, "Lila is being traumatized because reporters want a story. I can't protect Emily if I can't even protect my own daughter." Clara moved from the window, closed the distance between them with steps that revealed the desperation she was trying to suppress. "So you're choosing them over us?" The accusation landed wrong, twisted the reality of what he was doing. "I'm choosing to stop making your daughter collateral damage in something neither of us asked for. Emily needs a stable mother more than she needs me. You have to choose your company or whatever this is between us, and you should choose the company." He pulled the envelope from his jacket, held it out. "I wrote this for Emily. It explains that I'm not abandoning her, that some people are scared of things they don't understand, that she's stronger than she knows." Clara took the envelope with hands that trembled despite her attempt at control. Her eyes searched his face, looking for something he wasn't sure he could give. "What if I don't want you to go? What if I need you to stay?" The vulnerability in her voice cracked something in his chest, but the decision was already made. "You don't need me. You're figuring out how to reach her on your own. I just gave you permission to try." He stepped back toward the door. "Take care of her. And yourself." He left before she could respond, before the resolve could weaken, before the look on her face could change his mind. The elevator ride down felt longer than usual. 45 floors of descent that gave him too much time to question whether he was making the right choice or just the easiest one. But Lila was waiting at his sister's house, already packed and ready for what he'd framed as an adventure rather than an escape, and that clarity of purpose steadied him. Clara stood alone in her office, clutching the envelope, feeling the full weight of loss compound itself. Daniel had been taken without warning, without choice, without any chance to fight for what they'd built together. But Ethan was choosing to leave, making a decision that felt both selfless and impossible to accept, and Clara didn't know how to process the difference between death and departure. She opened the envelope, read his careful handwriting, and felt tears track down her face for the second time since becoming CEO. The letter was kind, honest, designed to help Emily understand without making anyone the villain. But it also felt like goodbye in a way that suggested permanence, like Ethan had decided this chapter was closed rather than just paused. The month that followed tested Clara in ways that quarterly earnings and hostile takeovers never had. She tried to explain Ethan's absence to Emily without making it sound like abandonment, but her daughter's face closed off with each careful explanation. The progress they'd made seemed to evaporate, Emily retreating back into silence that felt even heavier for having been broken temporarily. Clara attempted what Ethan had done, sitting with Emily without agenda, offering presence instead of solutions, but her own discomfort with unstructured time kept interfering. She'd schedule 2 hours to spend with her daughter, then find herself checking email after 30 minutes because the silence felt unbearable, and she didn't know how to just exist without purpose. The board settled back into cautious approval of her leadership now that the scandal was fading from news cycles. Marcus still circled like a predator, waiting for weakness, but Clara had shored up her alliances and delivered results that made challenging her position seem foolish. She'd saved her company, maintained her reputation, proven that she could make hard choices when required. But Emily barely spoke, barely smiled, moved through her days with mechanical compliance that was somehow worse than the tantrums had been. At least rage suggested fight. This new version of her daughter seemed to have accepted that attachment led to loss, that trusting people was foolish, that the world would keep taking away everyone who mattered. Clara threw herself into damage control projects, donated $1 million to children's mental health initiatives in what the PR team framed as her commitment to youth well-being. She gave a carefully crafted interview to a business magazine about balancing executive leadership with single parenthood, saying all the right things about priorities and resilience without revealing anything real. The performance was flawless. The hollowness was total. Late nights in her office became routine again, the penthouse too empty, and Emily too withdrawn to make home feel like anything other than another obligation. Clara would stand at the window, watching the city lights, and wonder if Ethan was looking at stars from wherever he'd landed, if Lila was sleeping peacefully, away from reporters and photographers, if making the right choice was supposed to feel this much like losing. The charity gala invitation arrived 6 weeks after Ethan left an annual event supporting arts education in public schools. Clara attended every year because it was expected, because the Kensington Foundation had been a major donor since her father's time, because showing up was part of the performance. She wrote the check, gave the perfunctory speech about the importance of music programs, and prepared to endure another evening of strategic socializing. What she didn't know, what no one had told her, because Emily had arranged it herself through her piano teacher, was that her daughter would be performing. Emily had been practicing in secret, working on a piece with determination that had been invisible to Clara's distracted observation. The piano teacher had mentioned a showcase, but Clara had only half listened, assuming it was informal student practice rather than the main event. The evening arrived with October chill settling over Manhattan, the kind of weather that required real coats rather than fashion statements. Clara dressed in a gown that cost more than most people's monthly rent, applied makeup with precision that created the illusion of well-being, and prepared herself for 3 hours of performance art disguised as philanthropy. The venue was elegant in the aggressive way expensive fundraisers demanded too many flowers, too much gold leaf waiters circulating with champagne and appetizers that looked like abstract art. Clara worked the room with practiced efficiency, writing checks and making promises and laughing at jokes that weren't funny because social currency required the transaction. The children's showcase was scheduled for 9 o'clock after dinner and speeches, but before people got too drunk to pay attention. Clara was preparing to leave early, had already made her excuses to the organizers when the lights dimmed and a spotlight hit the stage. A small figure walked out and Clara's breath stopped completely. Emily, wearing a velvet dress Clara didn't recognize, moving toward the piano with steps that looked terrified but determined. Her daughter hadn't mentioned performing, hadn't asked for support or attendance, had kept this secret like a gift she wasn't sure Clara deserved to receive. Emily sat at the piano, her hands resting on the keys, her small body vibrating with the kind of fear that precedes bravery. The room settled into expectant silence, hundreds of wealthy attendees waiting to applaud politely before returning to their conversations. Emily leaned toward the microphone, her voice small but clear enough to carry. "This is called Where Love Still Lives. My friend's daddy taught me. It was his wife's favorite song." Clara felt the room tilt, felt her carefully maintained composure crack and shatter. Emily's fingers touched the keys, and the melody that emerged was the lullaby Ethan used to hum, transformed into something more structured, but still carrying that original gentleness. The notes were simple, haunting, clearly the work of someone who'd written from emotion rather than training. Emily made mistakes. Her fingers stumbled on transitions. She hesitated during the bridge, but she kept going. Halfway through, a guitar joined from backstage, supporting her with gentle chords that wrapped around the piano melody like embrace. Clara's head snapped toward the stage entrance, and Ethan walked out, instrument in hand, his presence solid and real and impossible. He'd come back, had driven down from upstate for this, coordinated with Emily's piano teacher, in secret, made himself vulnerable to photographers and gossip, and everything he'd fled because Emily had asked. His eyes found Clara's across the crowded room, and the expression he wore showed everything he'd been holding back, love and fear and the desperate hope that this gamble would work. Emily's playing grew more confident with him there, the partnership between piano and guitar lifting the simple melody into something transcendent. The music swelled with emotion that spoke of grief struggling against hope of beauty, emerging from loss of the stubborn, human insistence on loving, despite knowing love could wound. When the last note faded, silence held for a long moment. Then applause erupted, genuine rather than polite, the crowd responding to something authentic in a room usually filled with a performance. But Clara was already moving, walking toward the stage without caring about protocol or appearances or what anyone thought. Ethan set down the guitar, met her halfway, his expression unguarded in ways it never had been before. Every defense he'd maintained, every careful boundary dissolved in the face of whatever was happening between them. Clara's voice came out raw, stripped of its usual authority. "Don't go! Don't leave us again!" The words were too quiet for the microphone to catch, but loud enough for him to hear. "I don't care what people think. I don't care about the company or my reputation or any of it. You taught me how to be human again. Emily needs you." Her voice cracked on the admission she'd been avoiding. "I need you." The room had gone silent again, everyone watching this moment unfold with the fascination people reserve for witnessing something real in spaces usually governed by artifice. Clara realized her words had been heard, were being recorded by phone cameras, would be online before the evening ended. There would be no taking this back. No strategic spin that could reframe this as anything other than what it was, a public declaration that she was choosing him over image, over control, over everything she'd built her identity around. Ethan searched her face, looking for certainty in the chaos. Are you sure once this moment is public, there's no undoing it? Marcus will use this. The board will question you. Everything you fought to protect will be at risk. Clara's response came without hesitation, every word weighted with finality. I'm sure. I choose this. I choose us. Emily launched herself at both of them before anyone else could respond, her small arms wrapping around their legs with the force of someone who'd been holding hope too tightly to breathe. Lila appeared from backstage where she'd been waiting, joined the embrace with the uncomplicated joy of a child who believed in happy endings. The four of them stood there under stage lights that made everything visible, two broken families becoming something new and undefined but unmistakably real. The applause was deafening, carrying notes of surprise and approval, and the kind of romantic satisfaction people craved from stories even when they judged them in real life. Clara didn't care about their response, was focused entirely on the circle of warmth surrounding her, on Emily's face pressed against her side, on Ethan's hand, finding hers with pressure that communicated volumes. The photographer from the New York Times captured the moment Clara, in her designer gown, Ethan, in clothes that showed he'd driven straight from work, the girls between them forming a bridge across every divide society had tried to enforce. The image would run above the fold the next morning, sparking think pieces about class and love and modern family structures. But that was future consequence. In the present moment, Clara felt something she'd stopped believing was possible. The specific peace that comes from choosing authenticity over image. A year later, Clara stood in a different office entirely. Smaller, less prestigious, but filled with natural light and the sound of children's laughter filtering through walls that weren't soundproofed. She'd stepped down as CEO of Kensington Holdings after negotiating terms that kept her on the board but freed her from daily operational demands. Marcus had gotten his promotion, finally would probably drive the company into a ditch within 5 years, but that was no longer Clara's problem to solve. Her new venture was the foundation she and Ethan had built together, honoring both Daniel's dream and Sarah's memory. They provided support for children who'd lost parents, therapy education programs, art classes, everything Clara wished had existed when Emily first went silent. The work was harder than running a corporation, required emotional availability. She was still learning to access, but it mattered in ways that quarterly profits never had. Ethan taught music classes in the community center they'd built, working with kids who needed someone to listen as much as instruct. His engineering background proved useful in unexpected ways. He'd designed a recording studio where children could preserve their memories in song, creating permanent documents of grief and hope and resilience. Clara would watch him through the window, sometimes see him with a shy teenager trying to find words for loss, and feel gratitude that terrified her with its intensity. Lila and Emily attended the same private school, now their friendship having evolved into something that looked like sisterhood. They were inseparable in the way of children who'd bonded through shared experience of adults figuring out how to love across boundaries. Emily still had hard moments when grief would surge unexpectedly, but she'd learned it was okay to feel young and happy, sometimes simultaneously, to carry stones in her pocket without letting them define the shape of her life. One afternoon, Clara stood at her office window, watching Ethan help a young boy tune a guitar. He wore the same patient expression he'd had in the janitor's break room that first day, the kindness that had saved Emily, and in saving Emily had somehow saved Clara too. She thought about the impossible journey that had brought them here, about the space between their worlds that had seemed uncrossable until a little girl's pain had built a bridge sturdy enough to support weight. Emily appeared beside her, slipping a small hand into Clara's with the casual affection that had taken months to rebuild. "Mom, are you happy?" Clara squeezed her daughter's hand, feeling the question's weight and simplicity. "Yes, sweetheart, I really am." Through the window, afternoon's sun painted everything amber and gold. Ethan looked up, saw them watching, and smiled with the kind of expression that communicated safety and home and the specific variety of love that survives impossible circumstances. Emily waved with her free hand, and he waved back, guitar still cradled against his chest. The foundation's waiting room held a dozen families. Parents who'd lost partners and children who'd lost anchors, all of them navigating grief that society expected them to process quickly and quietly. Clara's staff trained therapists and music teachers and grief counselors who understood that healing wasn't linear, would spend hours with each family offering what she'd learned the hard way, that sometimes the only way through pain was straight into its center. That connection mattered more than credentials. That showing up was 90% of survival. She'd been asked to write a book about her experience, publishers sensing commercial appeal in the billionaire and janitor love story. Clara had declined, understanding that some narratives became cheap when packaged for mass consumption, that what had happened between her and Ethan and their daughters was too raw and real to be commodified into inspiration porn for people who wanted redemption without discomfort. Marcus had tried to challenge her board seat in the months after she stepped down, launching a campaign to paint her departure as instability that endangered shareholder value. But the numbers told a different story. Kensington Holdings had thrived under new leadership that wasn't distracted by personal crisis, and Clara's strategic vision during quarterly board meetings proved she could contribute without micromanaging. Marcus's campaign fizzled after 6 weeks, revealing him as petty rather than principled. The gossip sites had moved on to newer scandals. Fresher blood, though occasionally a "where are they now" piece would surface showing Clara at foundation events, or Ethan teaching classes, or the girls performing at school showcases. The narrative had shifted from scandal to heartwarming society, having decided that what had seemed inappropriate looked romantic with the benefit of hindsight and successful outcomes. Ethan appeared in her office doorway, guitar case slung over his shoulder, his workday finished. Ready to head home. The word home still carried novelty that made Clara smile. They'd bought a brownstone in Brooklyn, far enough from Manhattan's scrutiny to feel private but close enough to the foundation's offices to maintain connection. It had a yard where the girls played, a music room where Ethan recorded demo tracks for the students, a kitchen where they attempted cooking together with results that ranged from edible to disaster. Clara gathered her laptop and the reports she'd review after dinner, the boundary between work and life still blurry but improving. She'd learned to leave her phone in another room during meals to sit through Emily's piano practice, without checking email to have conversations with Ethan that lasted hours and covered everything from foundation strategy to Lila's obsession with astronomy to the specific texture of grief on different days. They walked through the foundation building together, past classrooms where kids were learning instruments and therapy rooms where families were learning each other again, out into October evening that carried the smell of fallen leaves and approaching winter. The subway ride home was familiar now, Ethan's hand in hers, feeling less like revolution and more like routine. Emily and Lila were already at the brownstone delivered by the car service Clara had insisted on despite Ethan's protests about spoiling them. The girls burst out the front door as they approached Lila, chattering about a science project involving moon phases. Emily quieter but carrying a drawing she'd made in art class, 4 stick figures holding hands under a yellow sun. The kind of image that suggested safety had been internalized enough to express visually. Dinner was chaotic in the way family meals are when everyone talks over each other, fighting for airtime with stories about their day. Clara burned the garlic bread despite setting multiple timers, and Ethan salvaged it with humor that diffused her frustration. They ate at the table that was too big for the dining room, but had belonged to Clara's parents, connecting past and present in ways that felt like honoring rather than haunting. After dinner, Emily pulled Lila to the piano, their nightly ritual of practicing duets they'd composed together. The music drifted through the brownstone, filling spaces that had been empty for too long, proof that beauty could emerge from wreckage if given enough time and care and the stubbornness to keep trying. Clara and Ethan cleaned up together, their movements synchronized from repetition, shoulders bumping occasionally in the narrow kitchen. He washed while she dried, reversing the traditional choreography because his hands were too scarred from years of janitorial work to tolerate the hot water she preferred. These small accommodations had become the language of their partnership, neither keeping score or demanding equality in every transaction, trusting that balance would emerge over time. Later, after the girls were asleep and the brownstone had settled into nighttime quiet, Clara and Ethan sat in the music room with glasses of wine that had been expensive once, but now just tasted like Tuesday evening. She leaned against his shoulder, feeling the solid reality of him still sometimes unable to believe they'd survived the journey from that first meeting in the break room to this domestic peace. His voice carried the soft rumble of someone tired but content. Emily's teacher thinks she should audition for the youth conservatory program. Says she has real potential if she wants to pursue it seriously. Clara processed this information, feeling the familiar tug between wanting to provide every opportunity and remembering that pushing too hard had nearly destroyed everything. What does Emily want? Ethan smiled in the darkness. She wants to think about it, which is exactly the right answer. The city hummed beyond their windows, 8 million lives being lived in proximity, each person carrying their own stones and stories. Clara thought about the version of herself that had stood in that conference room watching Emily destroy things in rage, about the woman who'd believed control was the same as strength, about the CEO who'd measured worth in quarterly returns rather than the sound of her daughter's laughter. That woman felt like a stranger, now someone Clara had been rather than someone she was. The transformation hadn't been sudden or complete. She still struggled with presence, still checked email more than she should, still sometimes tried to solve emotional problems with strategy rather than sitting with discomfort. But she was learning, growing into the kind of mother and partner and human she'd needed to become all along. Ethan's hand found hers in the darkness, their fingers interlacing with the ease of practiced intimacy. "Thank you," she whispered, though the words felt inadequate for what he'd given her. He understood anyway. "Thank you for choosing us, for being brave enough to let everyone see you being human." The moment stretched between them, comfortable and profound, two people who'd met across an impossible divide and decided the space between their worlds was worth crossing. No one could have predicted this ending when Emily first heard Ethan's lullaby drifting through ventilation shafts. No expert would have prescribed a janitor as therapy for a traumatized child. But sometimes healing came from the most unlikely sources, and love grew in spaces where logic said it couldn't possibly take root. The impossible thing, Clara thought as she leaned into Ethan's warmth, wasn't that a janitor could reach a CEO's daughter. The impossible thing was that in a world obsessed with status and wealth and keeping people in their designated places, they'd all chosen connection over comfort, chosen authenticity over image, chosen each other despite every reason not to. And somehow, miraculously, that choice had been enough to build something that looked like family, felt like home, and proved that the distance between two worlds was only as wide as the courage required to cross it.